So when we talk about labor markets, let's just start from the very basics. So the labor market, just like other markets, there's decisions of what to produce, how much to produce, and when. So the labor market is the market that allocates workers to jobs and coordinates employment decisions. So the labor market is what brings together the employers and the employees. In the market, there's decisions made every day on career choices, hiring, firing, quitting, and compensation. Every market has buyers and sellers, but with the labor market, just like with other factors of production, it's kind of switched a bit. So the firms are and I use the term loosely, the buyers in the market, and the individuals are the sellers. Now, labor is not like the product market. You're not selling your labor, you're renting it in one way. So there's two types of labor markets. There's a national and there's a local. The national is when buyers and sellers search the entire nation. And where you're going to see national markets is more of the skilled markets, the markets where there's a limited amount of labor. So for example, college professors, doctors, engineers. Right, these groups are going to search and for that match on a national level. Local labor markets, that's where the searches are only on local. And this is for more and I use the term loosely, the less skilled workers. And so that's clerks, mechanics, and again, I use this term loosely. And it's basically where there is a higher supply by area. So when we look at the labor market, the place to start is the population age 16 and over. And the reason why we look at 16 and over is because that's the people who can legally work without really any restrictions. Okay, in some states you can work if you're 14 and 15 years old, but there are restrictions to that. So the focus when you look at the labor market is 16 years and over. Now you also look at individuals who are what is called non-institutionalized because they cannot work because they're in an institution, a prison, or a psychiatric hospital, or a long-term care facility. But we'll focus on the 16 and over group. So that population, and there's 253 million as of 2016, is split between two groups, the labor force and not in the labor force. Labor force about 159 million, non-labor force 94. So what does that mean then? Who's in what group? What determines what's in that group? Well, it comes down to if you're in the labor force, you're either employed or unemployed. Okay. And to be considered employed, all right, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky, you need to have a job. Okay, that's simple. But to be unemployed, it's not as easy. It's not as simple as you might think. You might think, well, what's in between unemployed and not in the labor force? Well, to be considered unemployed, clearly you don't have a job. But to be considered unemployed, you either have to not have a job and be what's called actively searching. Okay, so you have to look for a job in the past few weeks, at least 4 weeks, or you don't have a job but you're waiting for a callback. So for example, you are in a seasonal job and you're waiting for it to begin again. So you're not going to be searching, but you're still going to be, you're still going to be, the goal is to enter the labor force or enter the employed. Or you have to have had a job and are expected to start within, I believe it's 30 days. Okay. So again, you're not going to be looking, but you're expected to start. So these are the kind of the breakdowns. Now, the biggest thing with unemployed is actively searching. So what happens is there's a lot of flows between these groups. And so we have flows from employment to unemployment. This flow is the biggest one, or flows. So to move from being employed to unemployed, it can be the case where you were fired or you quit. Now the opposite, going from unemployed to employed, is if you get a job, you get a notice of some sort of a recall, or you, that's not it. So going from unemployed to employed, you're newly hired or you were recalled. So those are the ones that most people know. But there's a lot of other flows that people don't quite realize. And they happen between not in the labor force to and from in the labor force. So going from not in the labor force to in the labor force, you can either, you're not in labor force, you're not actively looking, so you're not employed, but you get a job. So you can go from not in the labor force to employed. You can also get recall of a notice. So you're not looking, you're not actively looking, but you, a job called and said, if you want to come back to work, you can. You'll start next week. And so you move from not in labor force to employed. Or you can just start looking. You can say, all right, well, I'm not employed, I'm not looking for a job, but I think I want to start. The area where a lot of people don't realize there's a lot of flow is from in the labor force, mostly unemployed, to not in the labor force. So going from in the labor force to not in the labor force, there's two main ways. And the biggest way is that you just retire. Okay, you decide to retire from working. So you go from being employed to not in the labor force. Okay. The other way is that you stop seeking. So let's say you lost your job, so you went from being employed to unemployed. Okay. But you're just not looking anymore. You gave up. And this is a big reason for a lot of the decline in the labor force participation rate, which we'll talk about in a minute, after 2008 to 2010, when there was the national recession that hit the country. And what happened was people lost their job and they were looking for a long time. Their unemployment benefits may have ran out, and so they just gave up looking. Now, this is a problem when it comes to measuring, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But these workers are known as discouraged. So they go from being unemployed to not in the labor force, okay, because they stop searching. So in 2016, there were roughly 159 million people in the labor force. About 62 to 63% of the population 16 years and older. Okay. Now, the other thing to discuss is the labor force participation rate. So the labor force participation rate is the percentage of the population age 16 and older who is in the labor force. Okay, they're in the labor force. Okay. That means they're either employed or unemployed. Now, if we look at the labor force participation rate in the United States, this is from 1956 to 2016, you can see that in general it goes up and down, but there was a general trend of increasing. But then you had this dip here, went back up a little bit, and then another big dip here. Now, for the most part, most of these dips are during recessions. So with recessions, there's high unemployment. Okay. But what can happen is through the discouraged workers especially, a lot of people can be dropping out of the labor force. Okay. They just give up looking, so they're not considered unemployed. Now, and then you've seen recently that it's been going up. So if we look at the labor force participation rate by gender, you can see that we have 1950 through 2010, and then the 2016. There was a general trend leading up to 2000 of, overall going up, and then it went down, and then it's continued to decrease. Or, sorry, it's down compared to 2010, although it's been going up a little bit in recent years. If you look at the breakdown of men versus women, though, you can see a vastly different trend. So, from 1950, 86.8% of men were in the labor force. By 2000 and 2010, it went down pretty significantly to 74.8%, 71.2%. Women, on the other hand, have gone up very, very rapidly over that period. Okay. So there's two reasons for that when you really dive into it. The first is that women are just more likely to work today than they were 50, 60 years ago, 70 years ago. Okay. So the way of thinking used to be, it would be a man's job to work and the woman would stay home with the kids. That's not the mentality anymore. Now, for the most part, both spouses go and work. Okay. Now, part of that has to do with need because men just are not able to support a family on their own as much as they used to be. But the education levels of women has been going up, and so that all that has been driving to more women entering the labor force. Okay. Now, the other important thing to remember, though, is as that's happening, there's something else that's going on, and that's the trend of the people who are retiring. So the baby boomers now, who are those who were born after the war, a lot of them are retiring now. As that happens, that group, the percentage of them who are male, is going to be very, very high. So you have people who are leaving the labor force that are a high percentage male, but the people who are coming in, the people just coming out of college, it's much more equal there. And so that's another reason why you see the rates getting closer to each other. The other thing to look at is the unemployment rate. And the unemployment rate is the percentage of the labor force that is unemployed. And when you look at that and we look at the trends, you can see that there's a lot of movement up and down over the years. And for the most part, that has to do with recessions, to where it's higher during recession years, lower during expansion years. Now, the unemployment rate is the most widely measured metric of labor market conditions. If it's less than 5%, the labor market's usually considered tight. That means that jobs are considered plentiful, and the most who are unemployed are expected to be able to find work relatively quickly. If the unemployment rate is high, which is considered greater than 7%, markets are considered to be loose, to where workers are abundant. There's a lot of workers relative to jobs, and so it can be difficult to find it. Okay. Now, this is just the overall job market, whereas job market by education or occupation, they can be tighter or looser than the market as a whole. Now, the biggest problem with the unemployment rate is that it can be very misleading. And what that means is that it doesn't actually represent the way that it's collected, the percentage of the labor force that are looking, that are at least how they consider themselves unemployed. And that's to do with the idea of the discouraged worker. And so, recall back when we were talking about the idea of discouraged workers, people who gave up looking for work. Now, these are people who, if you went to them and said, okay, here's a job, do you want it? They would say yes. So even though they're not working, they do want to work. That's not measured in the official unemployment rate. Another big issue with the unemployment rate is it doesn't consider the workers that are, sorry, I lost train of thought. It doesn't consider workers that are working part-time but want to be working full-time. And so with unemployment benefits, you get paid, when you're unemployed, you collect unemployment, and you get paid an insurance for that. And we all pay into it with our paychecks. And what happens is when that runs out, if you need money and you can't just stop working, some people will take part-time employment. But when they do that, they will, they still want full-time, so they'll take it, but they're considered, I guess, underemployed is probably a good way to put it, to where they want to be working full-time, but they're not. So that's also not captured in the unemployment rate because they're considered to be employed. Now, you always hear when it comes to politics, both sides saying that, oh, the real unemployment rate's X%. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, they do different measures of unemployment rates. It's U1 through U6, and they have narrower and wider ranges of it. And probably the real rate of unemployment is, I believe it's U6, which measures a person's considered to be employed if they have a job, and a person is considered to be unemployed if they normally would be, like we discussed, but also if they are what's called marginally attached, where they would take a job if offered, or if they were working full-time, or they were working part-time but would want to work full-time. So all these workers are considered unemployed in that case. And so depending on the measure, you'll have different rates, but that just illustrates the problem with the unemployment rate.